It all started right where it ended, at St. Malachy's Church in Tyrone, Northern Ireland. In December 2010, beauty queen and teacher Michaela Hart and sports star John McCarivy tied the knot, sharing their celebration with over 300 guests. However, just 3 weeks later, John returned with the body of his young wife, who was buried in her pristine wedding gown. What led to Michaela's death? Who could be so heartless and calculated as to take the life of a woman, who had just begun to enjoy married life with her beloved? And will the collaborative efforts of multiple countries help uncover one of the most memorable and harrowing crimes of recent years? The captain of the Irish football team, John McCarivy, and the daughter of one of the country's top football managers, Michaela Hart, met at university in 2005. It was love at first sight, and since then, the young couple had never been apart. During a vacation in Paris, John proposed to Michaela, and she happily accepted. They planned their wedding for New Year's Eve, on Michaela's 27th birthday. After the ceremonial wedding, the newlyweds boarded a plane, embarking on their 3-week honeymoon. They spent the first week in Dubai before the most anticipated part of their trip began, 2 weeks at the 5-star Legends Hotel, located in the fishing village of Grand Gauba on the northeast coast of Mauritius. Michaela chose Mauritius as their paradise island for the dreamy honeymoon and carefully researched local hotels. They settled on Legends Hotel due to its numerous positive reviews and popularity among tourists from Ireland. Upon arrival at the hotel, they asked the receptionist if they could be allocated one of their best rooms. They were informed that there was a vacant room in the luxury block, room 1025. January 10, 2011, after having breakfast together, John decided to play golf while Michaela sunbathed. They met again for lunch. Michaela always enjoyed having tea with something delicious after lunch. She asked her husband to order tea while she went to the room to get Kit Kat bars with her favorite dark chocolate, which she had brought from Dubai and kept in the refrigerator. John offered to bring the treats for her, but it was only 150 steps from the restaurant to the room, so she went by herself. John took some photos and watched videos while waiting for his wife to return. After some time, he began to wonder why Michaela hadn't come back yet. He decided to look for her. Knocking on the door, John received no response. Since he had forgotten his key in the room, he peeked through the window but couldn't see anything, so he went to the receptionist. The corridor attendant led him back to the room and opened the door with his key. However, as soon as the corridor attendant took a few steps away from the door, he heard the cries of a man asking for immediate help. Upon entering the room, John discovered his wife in the bathtub filled with cold water. Bruises were visible on her neck, her skin was icy to the touch, and her lips had turned blue. Assuming that Michaela had intended to take a bath due to back pain but slipped or lost consciousness, John attempted to help her. However, his efforts were in vain. Within an hour, medical professionals pronounced Michaela's death, bringing an end to the dreams of a young and happy married couple. Presumably, due to the initial assumption of an unfortunate accident, nobody attempted to secure the crime scene, and people constantly entered and exited the newlyweds' room. The police were initially informed that a tourist had drowned, but upon entering the room and observing the state of Michaela's body and the disorder in the room, they suspected a murder had taken place. The distraught husband was taken to the police station and held for questioning for 5 hours. This was not unusual since most murders are committed by individuals close to the victims. What was abnormal in John's case was the cruelty and inappropriateness of the statements made by the police officers. Naturally, John couldn't hide his tears over the loss of Michaela. Just half an hour earlier, he had seen his wife happily walking towards their room, but now he discovered her lifeless body in the bathtub. However, upon seeing his tears, a police officer, perhaps trying to console him, said, "Why are you crying? You're still young. You'll find yourself a new wife." It is unknown how long they would have kept John at the station if it hadn't been for the hotel manager's intervention. The manager informed the police that the door of room 1025 had been opened with a stolen master key that fit all the locks. It became evident that the murder had been committed by someone from the hotel staff. It was likely an unintentional murder. Someone among the staff, possibly a security guard with access to the master key, entered the room at 2:42 p.m. 2 minutes later, Michaela opened her own door. The thief, possibly hiding in a small niche in the bathroom, had to quickly consider his options due to the unexpected presence of the maid. If his duties involved room cleaning, he could have simply smiled at Michaela, pretended to do his job, and nothing would have happened because it's a common situation in a hotel. However, if he was a security guard, he knew that his presence in the room would not be easily explainable. So, the only option he saw for himself was to hide in the bathroom and hope that the woman would simply leave. But that didn't happen. As investigators speculated, Michaela decided to take advantage of the opportunity and entered the bathroom. Inside, she encountered the thief. Michaela got scared and ran, and the thief, in panic, attacked her. Realizing that he had killed Michaela, he placed her in the bathtub. Perhaps he tried to create the appearance of an accidental incident with the maid. Despite the shock, he may have also thought that water would wash away any DNA evidence left on his victim. When John got up from the table at 3:05 p.m. and went to check why his wife was taking so long, the killer was still in the room. If John had his keycard with him, he could have caught the killer at the scene of the crime. However, by the time he went to the administrator, asked for the door to be opened, and entered the room, it was already 3:26 p.m., and the thief, unintentionally turned murderer, had vanished. Releasing John put the police under immense pressure. When a tourist is killed in a country that heavily relies on tourism, it becomes crucial to quickly solve the case. It seemed like the case would be solved promptly because the local police chief stated that the island had a 100% homicide clearance rate. One might think he was just acknowledging the efforts of his subordinates, but any professional would be suspicious considering that in 2011, besides Michaela, 30 other people were killed on the island, and all cases except Michaela's were solved based on confessions from suspects. The following year, the police once again solved all cases based on confessions. The fact that the police excessively relied on instinct and intuition, if it can be called that, could have been compensated by the fact that the investigators had an ideal crime scene. The hotel room was cleaned every day, each entry into the room was recorded by the security system, surveillance cameras were placed everywhere, and the hotel itself was practically an impregnable fortress, with vigilant security guards everywhere. As it will become clear shortly, that was not the case at all. Within 2 days of the murder, the police arrested several hotel employees, and two of them, Avinash Tribhuwan and Sandeep Muniya, were charged with the murder while the others reluctantly became key prosecution witnesses. A week later, a hotel security guard named Dasan Narayanan was also arrested. Dasan was on duty on the day of the murder. His exact location at the time of the crime could not be confirmed, but his fingerprints were found on a fake key that the thieves used to replace the stolen universal key in the security room. Dasan couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how his DNA ended up on the safe door in the room. He admitted to touching Michaela's cheek when he rushed to help John, offering an explanation in advance for how his DNA could be present if it was found. However, despite Dasan's conflicting statements, the police decided to charge him only with being an accomplice to the thefts, focusing their main efforts on Avinash and Sandeep. On May 22, 2012, the trial began. The prosecution built its case primarily on the confession obtained by the police, following their customary practice. Prosecutors argued that when Michaela returned to the room on that day, she caught Avinash and Sandeep stealing money from the safe or her purse. Since hotel employees are often the main breadwinners for their families, not just immediate relatives, the thieves preferred to silence Michaela to avoid losing their jobs. During the trial, their colleague Raj Thikoy also testified. He was initially arrested but became the key prosecution witness and received immunity. Raj stated that he was near the room and heard the agonized cries of a woman but didn't knock on the door. Instead, he hid and saw the agitated and sweaty Avinash and Sandeep leave the newlyweds' room. Later, he asked what had happened, and they replied, "Nothing happened, just keep quiet. If you say anything, we'll involve you in this matter." In addition to witness testimonies, the prosecutors largely relied on the confession obtained from one of the suspects, Avinash Tribhuwan, following the customary police practices. Despite the fact that Sandeep and Avinash were the accused, it created an impression that the police themselves were being judged alongside them, as they conducted a careless investigation. The defense attorneys drew attention to all the evident gaps, inaccuracies, and blatant errors made by the investigators. Firstly, after the discovery of Michaela's body, the hotel was not sealed off, and not a single guest or staff member was interviewed. Some tests were not conducted, while others were only performed after the hotel room was returned to the hotel's control, compromising the evidence. Fingerprints and palm prints were found in the room, but their owners were not identified. However, no DNA evidence indicating the guilt of Sandeep and Avinash was found. Even the paper currency, which according to the prosecutors interested the thieves, was not fingerprinted or examined for DNA. The court also heard that all the crime scene photographs were taken in black and white, and many important items were not photographed at all. But the biggest uproar was caused by the mystery of the 46 surveillance cameras capturing the events inside and around the hotel. Despite numerous requests, the police did not hand over the video recordings to the defense attorneys. It turned out that they did not withhold the footage because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. 90% of the videos were erased by the police officers who were unable to operate the cameras. When asked to demonstrate how the equipment works, instead of honestly answering yes, they simply pressed the button. It happened to be the record button, and when they thought they were playing back the recordings, they were actually erasing them. The glaring incompetence of the police made international media wonder if the local authorities were deliberately sabotaging the investigation. Finally, the accused claimed that they only made confessions after being subjected to torture by the police. Dasan Narayanan, who allegedly gave Sandeep the key card, claimed that he was forced to make the confession under threat of a weapon. Avinash also denied his statements, stating that the police tortured him and interrogated him with water, after which he vomited blood. Furthermore, he was allegedly told that his wife would be deported and he would be forced to live in Ireland with John McCarivy, who would now need a new spouse. Avinash stated that he didn't even read his own confession because he simply signed the document that was presented to him. Another witness stated that he was forced to give false testimony, even though he and Sandeep were actually in room 1009 at the time of the murder, where a VIP client was supposed to stay, and Sandeep insisted on his subordinate maintaining perfect cleanliness in the room. At one point, he even grabbed a mop himself and demonstrated how the floors should be cleaned. Additionally, Sandeep claimed that he was on the phone with his sister in Britain at the time of the crime, which was corroborated by telecommunications data. Finally, the preserved surveillance camera footage also confirmed that he was in a different part of the hotel at the time of the murder. Overall, the court proceedings, which were expected to last for 2 weeks, dragged on for almost 8 weeks. This was largely due to the defense attorneys crossing the boundaries of decorum and turning the trial into a show. They constantly made jokes and elicited bursts of laughter among the bored onlookers and law students present in the courtroom. The defense raised the issue of there potentially being a sexual motive for the crime, hinting at the involvement of Michaela's husband. They referred to an intimate aid they found in the hotel room and insinuated possible misconduct between John and his wife. However, it turned out to be a simple insert from a women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, which Michaela had purchased at the airport. They then attempted to prove that John and Michaela had a severe argument, presenting a video that allegedly confirmed this. However, the individuals in the video were not Michaela and John but rather 2 people resembling them from Germany. As a result, John had to contact this man on Facebook and request him to provide a statement at a police station in Germany, confirming that he was the one in the video. Overall, Michaela's family was incredibly distressed by the sensationalism surrounding the case of her murder. In particular, a local newspaper conducted a survey titled "Who Killed Michaela?" and John ended up ranking high on the list of the readers' votes. Additionally, the Mauritian newspaper published by the police the photos of Michaela's naked and bruised body, causing indescribable anguish to her family. Nevertheless, these 8 weeks came to an end, and it was time for the jury members to make their decision. The judge summarized the case, clearly pointing out the guilt of the suspects, leading Michaela's family to believe that it would give the accused the right to demand a review of the case after a guilty verdict. They had no doubt that the verdict would be exactly as they anticipated. Furthermore, the judge strongly advised the jury not to consider the impact this case would have on the country's image but to make the right decision from their perspective. And after 2 months of trial, deliberating for only 2 hours, the jury declared Avinash and Sandeep innocent. After the acquittal verdict, John and Michaela's families were incredibly disappointed. They endured all the agony of the process, inappropriate remarks from attorneys and police, tolerated laughter in the courtroom, and even faced aggressive behavior from the locals because they were confident that the guilty parties would be punished for the murder. They were certain of Avinash and Sandeep's guilt and believed that they were acquitted because the case received global media attention, and the jurors did not want the murder case to reflect negatively on Mauritius' image. The Hart and McCavery families cannot forget that Avinash's lawyer appeared on a local radio station and essentially admitted his client's guilt, mentioning how Avinash cried and apologized to Michaela's family. The interview was supposed to be presented in court, but the lawyer managed to evade his responsibilities. John believes that Avinash told the truth when he confessed to Michaela's murder, and here's why. When anyone hears about death by strangulation, they imagine the killer choking the victim, gripping their neck with 2 hands. But Avinash recounted that when they were in the honeymoon suite, Michaela walked in and saw him holding a wallet. She asked what he was doing. She couldn't have known that Sandeep was in the bathroom. When the girl tried to prevent Avinash from leaving the room, standing in his way, Sandeep approached her from behind and wrapped one hand around her neck. The thing is, the autopsy report was compiled much later, and it confirmed that everything happened exactly as Avinash described. How could Avinash have invented such a method of strangulation if he didn't know it for sure? Additionally, Avinash mentioned that Michaela hit her head on the floor when she fell. The bruise on the back of her head, found during the autopsy, confirmed that as well. Furthermore, in summarizing the case, the judge reminded everyone that Avinash made his confession on January 12, and signed it on the 13th in the presence of his lawyer. If the police wanted to fabricate the confession, they would have forced Avinash to sign something else on the 12th. Moreover, the boy was examined by 3 doctors on different days, and none of them found any signs of torture on him. After the acquittal verdict, a new investigation was initiated. The police focused on a crucial piece of evidence, the keycard that the thief and murderer used to enter the room. However, even the mechanism of these locks cannot be trusted. The locks are not synchronized, and each of the 240 locks in the Legends Hotel shows its own time on the security systems panel, making it impossible to determine the exact time when the killer entered Michaela's room. As a result, the alibi of practically any suspect is in question because the exact time of the crime is unknown. To make matters worse, another significant loophole was found in the hotel's guest security. This loophole could increase the number of potential suspects from dozens to hundreds. If the hotel owns the guest rooms, restaurants, bars, golf courses and similar areas, the beach is considered public property. According to Mauritian law, the island's beaches belong to the local residents, and fishermen and traders have always had full access to both the beach and the hotel's premises. Local traders sell their crafts to tourists, and young boys are accustomed to spending time on the hotel's grounds. In other words, Despite the cameras, gates, and security personnel, the hotel is unable to provide complete protection of its premises, and there is no way to verify who had access to the honeymoon suite. As a result, the new investigation into the case also ended up with no significant breakthroughs. Under international pressure, the Mauritian police revisited Michaela's murder multiple times and even enlisted the services of a French laboratory for retesting DNA samples. In 2014, there was information about a breakthrough in the case when DNA found on Michaela's clothing matched the DNA of one of the suspects. However, this discovery was insufficient to warrant a new trial. In 2017, in an attempt to draw attention back to the case, John announced a substantial reward for information about the case. A few weeks after his return home, he received a call from a lawyer informing him that the arrests of Sandeep and Avinash were now inevitable. The lawyer did not specify the new evidence that made this possible, but Michaela's family felt relieved and believed that they would finally achieve justice. However, weeks and months passed, and no one was arrested. The case was officially closed in 2020, but in 2021, under pressure from Irish politicians, the Mauritian government agreed to reopen the case. The problem lies in the fact that the willingness to re-examine the case does not guarantee that it will be solved. Investigating any murder after 10 years is challenging, let alone considering the possibility that officials in Mauritius may lack the desire to find the killers. Over the course of 10 years, many investigators have climbed the career ladder, and if something is revealed in the case that many would prefer to bury, heads will roll. After the trial, John and Michaela's family filed a lawsuit against the hotel for €1.6 million. They settled the case out of court, and the details of the agreement are not disclosed, but the money went to a foundation established in Michaela's honor. Legends Hotel was renamed Lux Hotel and continues to enjoy immense popularity, as does Room 1025, which underwent renovations and was assigned the new number 1026. John, who now works as an accountant, met a pleasant girl named Tara Brennan at a memorial dinner for Michaela in 2013. Tara, also an accountant, received a marriage proposal from John in 2015. Last year, the couple welcomed their first child, James McAvery.
On the afternoon of September 23, 2007, the Miami Coast Guard responded to a report from Jeff Branham, owner of the fishing vessel Joe Cool. The boat had not returned from a trip to Bimini, the closest island in the Bahamas, located approximately 25 kilometers east of Miami. In principle, there was nothing unusual about the boat not returning on time. Passengers might get carried away with fishing or have a bit too much to drink and need to sleep it off, often asking the captain to stay out a little longer, which naturally leads to delays. Jeff Branham reported that 6 people were on board, 4 crew members and 2 passengers. It was an experienced team, typically helping tourists catch big fish, particularly tuna. However, the passengers this time were somewhat unusual. The 2 men were not interested in fishing at all. They had simply booked a one-way trip to Bimini. The captain was somewhat puzzled and directly pointed out that a short flight would cost them much less. Why book an expensive ocean trip instead? It turned out that the men could not fly because one of their girlfriends had accidentally packed his passport in her luggage. The girlfriends were now waiting for them on Bimini in another boat. The men agreed to pay $4,000 for the 2.5-hour journey. The captain was still unsure whether to take the job, but his uncle and co-owner of the boat, Jeff Branham, convinced him to accept. It was an international trip, which meant the company could later advertise trips to the Bahamas in its service offerings. Additionally, Jake and the crew could enjoy the opportunity to fish on their way back. On Saturday, September 22, 2007, the Joe Cool set off from the dock. Another very important trip was scheduled for the following day. The boat needed to be prepared in advance, so it was crucial for the crew to return on time. However, the next morning, when Jeff Branham expected to find the boat at the dock, it was nowhere to be seen. It was highly unlikely that the captain had intentionally extended the boat's stay at sea, knowing that other clients were waiting. Jeff called the port in the Bahamas and was horrified to learn that the boat had never arrived there. Since no issues on board had been reported, he found this extremely strange and contacted the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard began their search, and to better understand what might have happened on the boat, They investigated the crew members. All 4 crew members, Jake Branham, Kelly Branham, Scott Gamble, and Samuel "Sammy" Carey, were residents of South Florida. Jake and Kelly Branham were in their early 20s, a married couple raising 2 children. Their eldest daughter was 3 years old, and their youngest son was just 4 months old. Jake had dreamed from a young age of becoming the captain of his own boat, running fishing charters and tourist trips. Luckily for him, his family was very wealthy, and his grandfather provided the funds to purchase his first boat and set up the business. Jake acquired a 14-meter sport fishing vessel designed to handle rough seas. The boat was equipped with everything needed for tuna fishing, making it a top-notch vessel, perfect for catching big fish and hosting tourist trips. Jake's uncle, Jeff Branham, was listed as co-owner of the boat, while Jake's cousin assisted with administrative work. Jake's older brother, Scott Gamble, and a close family friend, Samuel "Sammy" Carey, joined the crew. By 2007, after just a few months in operation, the business was thriving, attracting many clients thanks to Jake's expertise in finding the best fishing spots. Kelly, Jake's wife, didn't always accompany the crew on trips. However, this short journey seemed too appealing to pass up. So Jake and Kelly asked Jake's grandfather to babysit their kids. At the scheduled time, the couple boarded the boat along with the rest of the crew and their passengers, and they set off on their voyage. The Coast Guard disseminated all critical information about the Joe Cool to nearby vessels, including a description of the boat, the number of people on board, and the purpose of its trip. Coast Guard patrol boats scoured the route the vessel was supposed to have taken, but there was no sign of it. They had no idea what might have happened to the boat. Other sailors, friends of the missing crew, joined the search effort. While the families of the crew members were undoubtedly worried, there was hope that everything was fine since Jake, Samuel, and Scott were highly experienced seamen. However, when the Joe Cool wasn't quickly located, an official search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters took to the skies, and a plane flying the route between Miami and Bimini was also enlisted in the search. The likelihood of finding the Joe Cool was high, as the area was frequently patrolled due to its reputation as a corridor for illegal activities, such as the smuggling of migrants, particularly from Cuba, and contraband. Predictably, it wasn't long before sailors aboard a Coast Guard vessel spotted a fishing boat. However, all attempts by officers to contact the vessel went unanswered. As the ship drew closer, the crew saw the name on the boat, Joe Cool. It was indeed Jeff Branham's missing vessel, but the circumstances surrounding the boat baffled rescuers. The Joe Cool was drifting nearly 50 kilometers north of Cuba, about 225 kilometers off course. For a sport fishing vessel, there was no need to venture that far, expending unnecessary fuel to find fish. The mystery deepened when they noticed the boat's 23-meter anchor had been lowered. Even though the water was over 60 meters deep, the boat couldn't have drifted so close to Cuba on its own. This was perplexing, especially considering its original course. The route from Miami to Bimini crosses the Gulf Stream, which flows northward at a speed of 8–10 kilometers per hour. If the boat had encountered mechanical issues, the current would have quickly carried it north. For the Joe Cool to end up so far south near Cuba, someone would have had to deliberately steer it against the current. So someone had brought the boat to this location, and now no one on board was responding to the Coast Guard's calls to establish contact. In such a situation, one could imagine anything. Pirates might have been hiding in the cabin, for instance. Proceeding with great caution, the officers boarded the vessel, but the boat was, in fact, empty. However, something had clearly happened. The chaos that reigned everywhere and the presence of blood told its own story. Wallets, car keys, and other personal belongings were still there, indicating that the people on board had not intended to leave the boat in a hurry. Where were the 6 individuals who had been on the Joe Cool? Perhaps the missing lifeboat could hold the answer. The Coast Guard immediately began searching for the lifeboat. They worked against the clock, as time was critical. Lifeboats are built to be sturdy, but the rescuers had no way of knowing the condition of the passengers and crew. Some or all of them could be injured, making every moment precious, especially as the weather began to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the Joe Cool was officially declared a crime scene. The Coast Guard called in the FBI, as crimes occurring on the high seas fall under their jurisdiction. 3 days had passed since Joe Cool left the port of Miami. On that day, a helicopter spent about an hour searching for the missing lifeboat when its crew spotted something orange floating in the water. It was the lifeboat. Its canopy was raised, but as the helicopter descended, the downdraft from its blades blew the canopy off. Inside the lifeboat, rescuers saw 2 people out of the 6 who had gone missing. This was not a promising sign. The rescue team lowered a basket and brought the 2 individuals aboard the helicopter one by one. Due to the noise in the helicopter, communication with the survivors was conducted using a notebook and pen. The pilot handed them the notebook, asking what had happened and if they were okay. One of the men wrote, "West of Bimini, we were left in the boat, hijacking, 4 killed." The survivors were identified as the 2 passengers of Joe Cool, Guillermo Zaraboso and Kirby Archer. The men claimed that there was no one else left to rescue. They explained that 3 Cuban pirates had boarded the boat and killed all the crew members. After such a statement, the Coast Guard had no choice but to call off the search efforts. Meanwhile, officers continuing their work aboard the Joe Cool discovered 4 shell casings. This aligned with the fact that there were 4 victims. However, the crime scene was peculiar. It looked as though a hurricane had torn through the boat, yet nothing had been stolen. If pirates had attacked the vessel, it would make sense that they did so for money or valuables. But they hadn't stolen the boat itself, the $70,000 worth of fishing gear, the electronics, or the credit cards. Instead, they left behind odd items: an air gun, darts for it, handcuff keys, and even a shuriken. Objects considered weapons, which no one would reasonably bring on a pleasant fishing trip. This suggested the pirates had brought these items with them, but why would they leave them behind? Additionally, experienced seamen immediately noticed that whoever directed the boat against the current had done so ineptly, causing it to run out of fuel far too quickly. Pirates operating in the ocean wouldn't have made such a mistake. All these details raised serious doubts among the officers about the accuracy of the 2 survivors' story. The next step for investigators was to interrogate Guillermo and Kirby. If anyone had answers to their questions, it had to be these 2 men. Both recounted the same story. According to them, 3 Cuban pirates boarded the Joe Cool and immediately killed the captain. Next, they shot Kelly because she began to panic. The pirates then ordered the 2 other crew members, Sammy and Scott, to throw the bodies overboard. When they refused, the pirates killed them too. Guillermo claimed that the pirates then forced him to dispose of the bodies, a task he complied with in the hopes of being spared. He also said he tidied up the boat slightly under their orders. The pirates allegedly forced Kirby to take control of the vessel, abandoning their own boat as they set course southward for Cuba. The journey lasted about 8 hours until the fuel ran out. At some point, a 3rd speedboat appeared, and the pirates supposedly boarded it and sped away, leaving Guillermo and Kirby stranded in the middle of the ocean. The 2 survivors decided to move into the lifeboat, bringing their belongings, and attempted to make their way to shore. However, the neat story Guillermo and Kirby had crafted quickly unraveled when investigators began asking follow-up questions. For instance, when asked about the pirates' appearances and clothing, Guillermo described 2 young men and an older man who seemed to be the leader. According to him, the pirates wore polo shirts and jeans, but Kirby contradicted this, claiming the pirates were dressed in shirts and shorts. Their accounts also conflicted on the sequence of the killings. Guillermo stated that Jake was still alive when he was thrown overboard, while Kirby claimed that Kelly was the one still breathing at that time. The biggest inconsistency was their inability to explain why they abandoned a fully operational, well-equipped boat to climb into the lifeboat. The Joe Cool had all the necessary equipment to send a distress signal, which would have immediately brought help from the Coast Guard. By this point, investigators had a clear idea of who they should suspect, but they needed concrete evidence. Now the challenge was finding a way to keep the men in custody while building their case. First and foremost, investigators delved into the backgrounds of the 2 men, and they uncovered a lot of surprising information. Guillermo was just 18 years old. His family had moved to the United States from Cuba in 1999, and after winning the visa lottery, they settled in Florida. The young man still lived with his parents. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and had never had any issues with the law. Guillermo was known to be polite, social, and considerate. He worked as a security guard, but had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. In fact, Guillermo had applied to join the police force right before he and Kirby boarded the Joe Cool. Overall, everyone who knew Guillermo regarded him as a kind, generous, and thoughtful young man, and no one had a bad word to say about him. The past of 35-year-old Kirby Archer was far more eventful. His legal troubles began in 1993 when he was 22 years old. He had joined the Army after being accused of involvement in a crime involving a minor. The charge stemmed from the fact that his 15-year-old girlfriend hadn't returned home to her parents on time. In the Army, he worked for a long period as a military police investigator at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. However, in 2003, he went AWOL, absent without leave, and was subsequently discharged from the Army. Kirby boasted that he simply chose the easiest way to leave the military, which he had grown tired of. After his discharge, he settled in Arkansas with his second wife and 2 children, but the couple soon decided to divorce. The breakup was extremely scandalous, as his wife accused him of having an affair with his own niece and fathering her child. Kirby denied any sexual relationship with his niece, but he did not deny being listed as the father on the child's birth certificate. Shortly after the divorce, Kirby became the subject of an investigation for child molestation. It's unclear whether the investigation was connected to his niece or whether it involved other matters, but the charges were serious enough that he was banned from seeing his own children unsupervised. Despite this, he eventually found love again and remarried for a 3rd time. In January 2007, about 9 months before boarding the Joe Cool, Kirby decided to test his luck. On January 26th, he went to work as usual. Kirby Archer worked as a customer service manager at a Walmart supermarket. At the end of his shift, he collected cash and checks, which was part of his duties. He then took the money, over $92,000, and the checks to a storage room. There, he took a new microwave out of its box, placed the money inside, and packed the microwave back into the box. After sealing it, he walked to the cashier, used his employee discount to purchase the microwave, and confidently walked out of the store. Kirby likely thought using his discount would make him look less suspicious, or perhaps he couldn't resist the chance to save a bit, even while stealing from his workplace. Either way, he knew the police would quickly catch up with him, so he fled. Kirby headed for sunny Miami. How did the young, law-abiding 18-year-old get involved with a 35-year-old criminal? Kirby met Guillermo in March or April of 2007. They had a mutual acquaintance, Carlos, who owned an auto repair shop. Guillermo had a strong interest in fast cars and enjoyed spending time around them. Meanwhile, Kirby had been telling Carlos that he worked for the CIA and had connections. Carlos, believing that someone with such connections could be useful to the young man, who was passionate about becoming a law enforcement officer, decided to introduce them. Investigators began to piece together why 4 people were killed. The police believed that Kirby, who was facing serious charges, had never intended to go to Bimini. From the start, he had planned to turn the boat toward Cuba. Cuba has no extradition treaty with the US, and since he had once served in the military on Cuba and spoke Spanish, it would have been relatively easy for him to disappear and blend into the local society. There were many aspects that supported the police's theory. First of all, the pirates' behavior was completely illogical. It wasn't just that they didn't take valuable items. It was the fact that pirates typically don't kill people on a ship they're hijacking. 1 or 2 people might get hurt, but pirates generally try to spare everyone's life because word of mouth spreads fast. Every sailor would soon know that encounters with pirates inevitably end in death, meaning that when pirates attacked the next ship, the victims would fight back to the last man. Additionally, the police searched both Guillermo's and Kirby's homes. While they didn't find any weapons on the boat, which the criminals likely threw overboard, they were able to link the men to the weapon used in the killings. Since Guillermo worked as a security guard, he had a permit to carry a weapon issued by Florida. At his home, they found a receipt for ammunition matching the caliber of the bullets used in the fatal shooting. The men were arrested. They were informed that the police had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and the prosecution would insist on the death penalty for them. Fearing the death sentence, Kirby Archer decided to confess. He explained that he had bought a gun, and Guillermo had taken his own gun. Initially, the plan was simply to hijack the vessel and drop off the crew somewhere on the way to Cuba. The accomplices thought they would be accompanied by 2 crew members and did not expect there to be 4. However, the plans did not change. During the trip, according to Kirby, Captain Jake Brenham behaved strangely, so Kirby told Guillermo to wait for a signal. But the young man didn't listen and shot Scott and Samuel. Then Kirby shot the captain and his wife. Afterward, the accomplices disposed of the bodies and guns and headed toward Cuba, but they ran out of fuel. They had no choice but to board the lifeboat and hope that the Cuban Coast Guard would find them and take them to Cuba. Once on the lifeboat, they made up a story about a pirate attack. Since Kirby Archer decided to confess, the only thing left was to determine his punishment. With Guillermo, things were not as clear. It was unclear whether he knew about the plan to kill the crew members or if he had become the 5th victim and an unwitting accomplice to Kirby. In prison, he shared his version of events with another inmate, and he repeated the same version in court in 2008 when he took the witness stand. According to his account, Kirby had initially told Captain Jake Brenham that he had changed his mind and wanted to go to Cuba. Jake, of course, refused, and a heated argument ensued. While Guillermo briefly went to the bathroom, shots were fired. When he ran to see what was happening, he saw Kirby holding his gun. That is, Kirby had rummaged through Guillermo's bag and taken his pistol. He shot all 4 members of the crew. Then Kirby pointed the gun at Guillermo and forced him to throw the bodies overboard and clean up. After that, he started the boat and headed south, but after several hours, they ran out of fuel. Guillermo wanted to stay on the boat with his luggage until help arrived, but Kirby threw the luggage into the lifeboat and told Guillermo to get into it too. There, he came up with the story about pirates that they would tell the rescuers. Guillermo agreed to stick to it because he was afraid of Kirby. In court, he did not dispute that he had brought a gun aboard, but not for murder. He thought it would be necessary for the security work they would be doing. Guillermo believed they were going to do private security work in Bimini, and then he would accompany Kirby to Cuba for a mission with the CIA. He believed until the end that Kirby worked for the CIA and did not know that he was being sought by the police. He hoped that if he helped Kirby complete this mission, Kirby would help him get into the CIA. He passed 2 polygraph tests, and according to the polygraph examiner, he had not planned the murders. However, the prosecution did not believe in Guillermo's innocence, and they had at least one piece of evidence that the defense could not explain. The Coast Guard studied the GPS data on the Joe Cool and found that halfway from Miami to Bimini, the boat suddenly stopped. The engine was inactive for exactly 1 minute and 18 seconds before it was started again and directed south toward Cuba. That is, if we are to believe Guillermo, in just over a minute, Kirby managed to kill 4 people and intimidate his accomplice into obeying him unquestioningly and throwing the bodies overboard. This was hard to believe. Additionally, Carlos, the owner of the auto repair shop, who had introduced Guillermo and Kirby, took the witness stand. He knew about the original plan of the defendants, which initially involved hijacking a local speedboat, reaching the Bahamas, refueling, and then heading to Cuba. However, they were unable to steal a suitable boat. In a few days before the trip, they bought weapons because, as Kirby had told Carlos, they switched to Plan B. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They decided that Guillermo was guilty of causing death with a firearm, but could not find him guilty of murder. The judge later explained that the jury might have made such a contradictory decision because they believed that Guillermo did not kill the people, but was guilty because his weapon was used. It was clear that the jury was confused. The judge had to annul the trial. The prosecution tried to retry Guillermo in 2009. Guillermo continued to maintain his innocence, convinced that his actions were part of an undercover CIA operation. The evidence in the second trial against him was exactly the same as in the first trial, except that the police found something interesting on the young man's computer. It turns out that he had told his friends he was planning a trip to Cuba for a CIA mission and warned them that they might see his name in the news as missing. However, he never mentioned the trip to Bimini. Additionally, he made many search queries with the word Cuba, but only searched for information about Bimini once. According to the prosecution, this indicated that the young man had known from the very beginning that they were heading to Cuba, not the Bahamas. In the second trial, the prosecution succeeded in securing a conviction against Guillermo. He was found guilty on 16 charges. Both men were sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Still, the prosecution could never explain why Guillermo got involved in this venture. If Kirby really had a reason to flee to Cuba and was willing to do anything for it, even murder, Guillermo had no such necessity. Did he agree to participate in the murder of 4 people just for the faint promise of a job in the CIA from someone he barely knew? In any case, the men had a plan to escape to Cuba, but they did not account for the amount of fuel needed for such a journey or the difficulties of navigating the boat against the Gulf Stream. Fortunately, their inexperience at sea allowed both of them to be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. 4 people lost their lives entirely unnecessarily. To this day, the bodies of the 4 crew members and the weapon used to kill them have not been found.
After escaping from the Bocas del Toro archipelago in early June 2010, Dayton and Laura crossed the border into Costa Rica, intending to lay low. The problem was that their faces were plastered across all newspapers and screens. In mid-July, they attempted to hide in a resort town an hour's drive from San Jose, but the hotel owners recognized them and called the police. With no real choice and the authorities on their tail, involving Interpol and the FBI, they decided to cross the border again. The natural border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua is the meandering San Juan River. On the 26th, Dayton and Laura stole a motorboat, tossing its owner into the water, and headed towards the Nicaraguan side. However, their escape was noticed by a group of soldiers. Confronted by a line of rifles, the fugitives surrendered. They were dressed in t-shirts, shorts, and flip-flops, appearing like clueless, lost tourists. However, their story didn't withstand scrutiny. They were handcuffed on the 2nd and taken to the nearest precinct. Cher Hughes and her husband Keith were enjoying life on a tropical island in Panama. It was a dream that initially seemed unattainable, to leave their mundane jobs, move to an exotic country, and acquire their own tropical island. Cher made it a reality in one of the most improbable places, among the tiny islands of Bocas del Toro, Panama. Cher grew up in St. Louis, where her beauty allowed her to enter the world of modeling at a young age. Later, she moved to Florida, where she started a company for innovative signage. She ran a successful business, was independent, and confidently pursued her dream of saving enough to travel extensively. She had traveled a lot, mainly within the USA, when a friend invited her to visit Bocas del Toro, and Cher couldn't pass up the opportunity. Bocas del Toro is the kind of place people go to escape the ordinary. A group of islands far from the coast of Panama and even farther from the beaten tourist paths. It's a place where life moves much slower and simpler. Cher visited the archipelago with her boyfriend Keith Whirl in 2000 and instantly fell in love with the picturesque land. It took them 7 days to decide where they wanted to spend the rest of their lives. With the money she had saved for traveling the world, she bought herself a piece of paradise. Cher and Keith had met 7 years prior in Florida when the attractive blonde walked into a bar owned by Keith. Seeing her big blue eyes and beautiful smile, Keith knew he was hooked. Keith was a carpenter and had built their dream home himself. He also owned several rental properties, providing them with additional income. Cher cultivated a garden and took in various animals, including a monkey and a Doberman pinscher named Jack, who adored Cher and followed her everywhere. Cher's and Keith's relationship blossomed on the island, and in 2005 they got married, surrounded by friends and loved ones. Cher had a great relationship with her family, and in the following years they often visited her in Bocas del Toro. Particularly in 2010, her sister Judy had planned to visit her. This would have allowed Cher to take her mind off things. The smooth flow of her 5-year marriage with Keith hit some rough patches, and Keith even left the island. Cher was distraught, but they still loved each other, and everyone around them was convinced that they just needed time to reconcile. Against this backdrop, Cher's sister was scheduled to visit, and the girls were excited about the upcoming reunion, constantly discussing joint activities. But suddenly, Cher stopped answering calls and messages. Judy realized something was wrong. She contacted Cher's friends in Panama, who informed her that Cher was not at home, probably having left. When Keith learned that his wife had left the island, he was surprised, but believed he knew where she was. Cher had talked about living in Panama City, a bustling city where she could blend in and contemplate her separation from her husband in a peaceful environment. For people living in Panama, moving back and forth was commonplace. That was part of the charm of the islands, but still, Cher couldn't have just vanished suddenly, leaving her home, belongings, and unanswered calls. Then her friends received a message from her saying she had gone swimming. It inspired them momentarily, but not for long. Several more days passed without a sign of her. Then another message arrived, this time for Keith. It read, "I met someone else. He is better than you," implying that she had left with him. Keith decided to get to the bottom of it. He called Cher's best friend directly and asked if his wife had another man in her life. The friend assured him that there was no such thing, and that Cher genuinely wanted to reconcile with her husband. She couldn't have run away. Keith noticed something else in his wife's messages. They were written in a style that was not typical of her. Even her emails were very well written, with no modern abbreviations, and the capital letter was only at the beginning of the sentence. But this message was written entirely in capital letters with abbreviations. Then the messages simply stopped coming. Cher's Aunt Mary contacted the embassy in Panama and asked for help. They replied that people disappear all the time, and if the niece wanted to be found, she would contact them herself. But when Cher didn't call her father on his birthday, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that she hadn't run away with a guy, wasn't hiding in an apartment in Panama. Something had happened. Her friends tried to figure out what had happened and remembered another American from their company who had also disappeared suddenly. Did anyone know anything about him? What if Cher wasn't the only missing person? On the picturesque islands of Bocas del Toro, a crisis was brewing. It had been 2 months since Cher had stopped communicating. Now her family and friends were questioning whether her disappearance was related to the disappearance of another American, Bo Islar, who had suddenly left the island 4 months before her. Bo was a pleasant but very quiet man. The former antique dealer had moved from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and was considered somewhat of a recluse, to the extent that few noticed when he suddenly vanished. In principle, he could have left without telling anyone, as it is easy to disappear from Panama. His action became even clearer when it was revealed that he had sold his house to William Adolfo Cortez, also an American living in Panama. Bo had mentioned to friends that he wanted to sell the house and move to a new place. Apparently, that's exactly what he did. But the memory of Bo's house continued to bother Keith, Cher's husband, after the man left. The house looked as if its owner had just stepped out for a minute to the store. Towels hung on the back of a chair, dirty dishes were piled in the sink. His shoes and cane were by the entrance. It was strange, so rumors began. 2 Americans had disappeared. Could their disappearances be related? When it was discovered that Bo had stopped paying his bills, which was entirely unlike him, mutual acquaintances of Bo and Cher became concerned and contacted the police. But they had no grounds to begin an investigation because 2 adults who had previously expressed their desire to leave had disappeared. Then, Bo and Cher's friends turned to someone who could help them. Another foreigner, Don Winner, the owner of a news site for expatriates living in Panama. Long ago, Don arrived in Panama with the American military intelligence and stayed there. The case of the 2 missing Americans caught his attention, so from Panama City he traveled to Bocas del Toro and simply started talking to the locals, trying to find out what they knew about the situation. Indeed, everyone confirmed that Bo and Cher couldn't have just disappeared and left everything behind. He checked and found out that Cher and Bo's passports hadn't left Panama. That meant they were still here. But where? There was another piece of the puzzle that pointed directly to a man living among them. Bo Islar was someone who had left last autumn. At the time, no one found it unusual, especially considering that he had sold his house to another foreigner, William Adolfo Cortez, known to everyone as Wild Bill. It should be noted that everyone on the island was simply called by their names or nicknames. For example, Keith and Cher were nicknamed Ken and Barbie. The owner of the local farm and bar was known as Wild Bill. Bill and his wife Jane had opened a bar in a remote area, accessible only by boat, where foreigners sometimes gathered for a drink or two. Usually, the flamboyant and charismatic Wild Bill stood out even among the fairly colorful personalities in Panama. He had established a local pirate club and was known for his lively parties. Don Winner delved deeper and found out that Bill had not only acquired Bo's house. Shortly after Bo disappeared, Bill and his wife became the president and secretary of a company they had created. Bill quickly renovated the house and advertised it for sale. It seemed like he was involved in buying and selling real estate. He had acquired a house in 2007 from the Brown family, who lived nearby Cher's house, the father, mother, and teenage son. Then he got Bo's house. However, it was only his next purchase that drew universal attention to him. Wild Bill unexpectedly announced that he had acquired all of Cher's property, including the island itself and the guest cottages built by Keith. Moreover, the island still had Keith's tools, Cher's belongings, and even her pets. Bill claimed that Keith would handle the matter with his wife when she returned. Keith requested at least the dogs and the tools back. Bill then returned 1 dog and several tools. Keith didn't intend to confront Bill, especially since everything was under Cher's name, and she did have the right to sell the property without informing her husband. But Keith couldn't believe it. They never fought over money. The island had become their home, and Cher simply wasn't the kind of person to act in this manner. Her relatives didn't believe it either. So Cher's Aunt Mary simply picked up the phone and called Wild Bill. She asked to see the property sale document. The man replied that he had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Mary asked to see the agreement and inquired if Cher had mentioned to Bill what she intended to do next. Bill stated that she had moved into an apartment in the capital. What about her belongings? Bill assured her that at Cher's request, he had sent her belongings, valuables, and money by air courier. Mary demanded to see the receipts for sending these things. She was convinced that Cher would never allow a barely acquainted man to rummage through her belongings in search of jewelry. There was more to it. No one could understand why Cher's entrusted dog, Jack, constantly jumped into the water and swam 2 kilometers to Bill's house again and again. However, Bill had many other concerns to think about besides the dog. Formerly cheerful and gregarious, he now tried to keep to himself, evading conversations. He was clearly nervous, and there was a reason for it. The more Don investigated the rumors, the more he became convinced that Bill was the key to finding Bo and Cher. It was a common denominator between the two of them. He had acquired their property, and both of them had disappeared. Don Winner decided to approach the official authorities and urged Kit to do the same. Kit went to the Capitol and informed the DIJ, the equivalent of the FBI in Panama, about everything. They did not brush him off and got to work. However, despite all the suspicions, there were no signs of criminal activity. There was essentially nothing to investigate. Then Don had an idea. He had heard a lot about how Wild Bill had an AK-47 and how he would sometimes shoot it to impress his friends. But in Panama, it is illegal for a civilian to possess such a weapon. Therefore, Don suggested that the police conduct a search, arrest him for possessing the weapon, and investigate what role he might play in the disappearance of the two people. And that's what they did. In July, officials flooded Wild Bill's house in uniform. The owners were nowhere to be found. The police began to search. They were looking for weapons when they saw Jack, Cher's dog. He had once again swum to Bill's house. The dog was behaving very nervously, circling around, barking at the policemen, and constantly running up the slope as if asking them to follow him into the jungle. The police officers, to their credit, followed Jack and found the spot where a pit had recently been dug. Kit was waiting at the foot of the hill at the time. He saw the officers climb up with shovels. They descended 2 hours later and asked him to look at something. In a shallow grave under a heap of garbage, the police found Cher Hughes's body. She had been shot once in the back of the head. It was only now that Kit began to understand why Jack kept returning to Bill's house. He would swim 2 kilometers and just stand there by his late owner's grave, but the horror did not end there. As the police continued to search Bill's property, they found another mound of land. Under it lay Bo's body. He had also been shot in the back of the head. Furthermore, in Wild Bill's house, the police found a mass of other evidence, documents belonging to Cher and Bo, as well as Cher's phone from which messages had been sent. The police issued an all-points bulletin for Wild Bill and his wife, Jane, whom they also considered involved in the crimes. But they were too late. The two had disappeared. Bill and Jane were on vacation when, on June 11, 2010, a friend informed them that the police were at their house. That same night, they left for Costa Rica, where they moved from hotel to hotel, but they were recognized there, and they made a desperate attempt to get to Nicaragua by boat, where soldiers intercepted them at a checkpoint. It was only then that it was revealed that the man's real name was William Dathan Holbert. 30-year-old Dathan had been evading the American police since 2006. He had an impressive criminal history that stretched from the white sandy beaches of Bocas del Toro to the mountains of North Carolina. It was there that he was born, played football on the school team, got married, became the father of 3 children, and worked as a landscape designer. He was well liked by his employer at the sports center until he embezzled $25,000. And that was just the beginning. Dathan quit his job and his wife and fled with Laura Michelle Reese, who later transformed into Jane Cortez. In 2005, he began to commit real estate fraud. He sold someone else's house for $200,000. By the time the house's owner found out what had happened, Dathan had vanished. Meanwhile, he sold a stolen car, and when he was pulled over for speeding in Wyoming, he simply fled. However, after the man moved to Panama, his crimes became more sinister. The people of Panama were horrified, but they did not know that Dathan had much more heinous crime under his belt. Now, behind bars, Wild Bill was ready to reveal all his secrets, to which the people of Panama were not prepared. 27-year-old Laura Michelle Reese gave absolutely no comments and refused to speak to the police. She claimed to know nothing about the family that sold them the house in Panama, how much her husband paid for the property, or who the decorations, chains and bracelets of Cher Hughes, which were on Laura at the time of the arrest, belonged to. On the contrary, Dathan turned out to be surprisingly friendly and talkative. He was happy to return to Panama, happily conversing with journalists in Spanish. Dathan admitted that he invited Bo under the guise of a meeting with his lawyer regarding the sale of the house. He shot the man in the back of the head when he was driving him on his boat. As for Cher, it all started with friendly gatherings and dinners at his house. After that, he led her to see some animals behind the house, and when she turned to look at them, he killed her. The motive was obvious. money. He wanted to take possession of their property. But even the most experienced police officers were shocked when they heard what else Dayton had done. He drew a plan of his house, marking crosses where the bodies were buried. On his map, they counted not 2 crosses, but 5. Not only Cher and Bo died at the hands of Wild Bill, but also the father, mother, and their teenage son. The Brown family, one owners of Bill's house, Cher's neighbors. Dayton saw Michael Brown's advertisement for the sale of the house and called him. The men agreed to meet. Initially, Dayton planned to rob Michael, but when he saw his house in a remote, picturesque place, he changed his mind and decided to kill him and his family. Michael confided in Dayton and told him about his business. He explained that he managed capital through a shell company. Similar companies dealt with bearer shares. In essence, whoever owned the shares was the owner of the corporation. Michael's property in Panama also belonged to the company. If I kill him, Dayton pondered, the shares will be mine, and along with them, the real estate. So, being a guest in Michael's house, Dayton somehow asked the owner to show him the well he had dug on his property. He agreed and led him to the well. There, Dayton shot him in the back of the head. He returned to the house and told Michael's teenage son, Watson, that his father asked him to take a shovel and help him. He killed the son in the same way and in the same place as the father. Then he returned to the house and found Michael's wife, Manchitha Nankratok, in the garden. She was bent over, tending to the flowers. Dayton shot her too. To make sure that all 3 were dead, he fired an extra bullet into each. In the owner's cabin, he found documents and passwords from bank accounts. So he claims, although after the fate of the Brown family became known, there were rumors that Dayton tried to force Michael before killing him. Michael kept money in Hong Kong and transferred small sums to Panama. Dayton requested a new card with a new PIN because he didn't know the old one. He sent the request to Hong Kong because in Panama, they would have asked for identity confirmation. After some time, Dayton received the card in an envelope at the post office. All he had to do was say that he was picking it up for Michael Brown. In Bocas del Toro, such things are easier to do than said, boasted the man. In addition, Dayton confessed to killing another American, Jeffrey Klein. Dayton claimed that he died when they fought on a boat and that to avoid punishment, he devised his way of getting rid of the body. He buried him and then, after a few days, set up a picnic area near the burial site. After the truth came to light, people perceived him as a serial killer who kept victims' belongings in his house as souvenirs. But he himself claims not to be a serial killer. He does not deny the crimes and immediately confess to them, but they never gave him any pleasure. He did not wake up one morning with the decision to kill his neighbors. Dayton knows that he got what he deserved, but he cries and repents only for his wife, who now has to go through all of this. It will take 7 years to achieve justice. During this time, his wife divorced Dayton while the two were in prison. In August 2017, he was found guilty and sentenced to 47 years in prison, while his wife was sentenced to 26 years. If he has other victims, it will be practically impossible to find out. After all, Dayton mainly hunted loners before he met Cher. Choosing a sociable girl with a lot of friends and relatives who would not stop looking for her was his main mistake. It's no wonder they say that some people never disappear. Even while in prison before the trial, Dayton used his phone, computer, and internet access. He continued to log into his Facebook page and even became a sponsor of the prisoners' football team, buying them sports uniforms. Today, he serves as the chairman of the Christian Organization for Inmates, leads an international human rights organization for prisoners, was appointed a chaplain and later a pastor of the Catholic Church in prison. Finally, he acts as a mediator and negotiator between various aggressive prison gangs. On January 7, 2019, he married a local girl, Elizabeth Nunes, and confesses that he enjoys conjugal visits very much. At the end of the year, Dayton published his prison memoirs, in which he described his escape from the authorities, arrest on the Nicaragua-Costa Rica border, extradition to Panama, and the first years in confinement. Let's transport ourselves to the picturesque and idyllic beaches of Thailand, more precisely to the island of Koh Tao. Koh Tao translates to Turtle Island, and although it's not as large as its neighboring islands, Koh Samui, where the international airport is located, and Koh Phangan, known for its full moon beach parties, Koh Tao has earned its own reputation over the years, primarily due to its magnificent underwater world that attracts scuba diving and snorkeling enthusiasts, as well as its constant parties. However, like in many other places blessed with natural beauty, Koh Tao has a dark side. Alongside the lively entertainment and tourists come illegal substances and organized crime. Petty thefts from tourists have become commonplace, although they are not unique to such exotic locations. However, in the latter half of 2014, the island gained a truly chilling notoriety as the Island of Death, from which it has yet to recover. Like other vacationers, Hannah Witheridge and David Miller arrived on Koh Tao in search of adventure in late August 2014. Hannah, a 23-year-old student from the British village of Hensby, wanted to relax before starting her master's degree in speech therapy. She believed that Thailand would be the perfect place for it. Her family tried to dissuade her from the trip, but Hannah suddenly booked the tickets and declared that she would go after all. She arrived on the island in the company of 3 friends and kept in constant contact with her family, who were worried about her safety. David lived on the small island of Jersey, located between Britain and France. The 24-year-old engineering student was about to begin an internship at a mining company, and also decided to relax before his final push in his studies. He came to Koh Tao with 2 close friends. Hannah and David were not acquainted before visiting the island, but they quickly became friends when they stayed at a small hotel just a few steps from Sairi Beach. The students were enjoying what the exotic island had to offer: the opportunity to see a reef shark or a manta ray while diving, or to admire the breathtaking views from the viewpoint. And if they wished to relax and unwind, there were plenty of restaurants and bars right on the beach. On September 14, 2014, around 7 o'clock, Hannah and David, along with their friends, were at a beachside bar. After midnight, Hannah and her 3 friends entered another bar on the beach. Surveillance cameras captured David going into a supermarket and walking the streets, and by 2 o'clock in the morning, he joined Hannah. After 2:15, Hannah and David left the bar together, taking a romantic stroll along the beach, unable to resist the allure of the ocean. The young couple was just a few meters away from the safety of their hotel. Soon after sunrise, the hotel owner was awakened by one of his beach cleaning staff. He followed her to Sairi Beach, where a horrifying scene awaited him. Blood had mixed with the sand. What caught his eye first was Hannah's body. The young woman was partially undressed, brutally beaten, and likely a victim of violence. 2 meters away from her in the water was another body, David. His head showed severe injuries, but it would later be revealed that he had died from drowning. Near the bodies lay clothing soaked in blood, along with 2 presumed murder weapons, a bloodied garden hoe and a wooden bat. The news of the crime quickly spread across Koh Tao. For an island with only 6 police officers, it was a serious challenge. The officers couldn't even properly secure the crime scene, and onlookers managed to take numerous photos of the bodies, which later ended up on the internet and even came to the attention of the victims' relatives. The way the police initially handled the case could have embarrassed Thailand on the world stage, so an officer was sent from the main headquarters to oversee the work of the local police. He promptly offered his apologies to the victims' parents. Despite the difficulties in launching the investigation, the police focused on the evidence: cigarette butts, the murder weapons, and the bodies of Hannah and David. They found DNA from 2 men. It became evident almost immediately that the course of the investigation would be heavily influenced by one crucial force: the desire to protect Thailand's tourism industry at all costs. Fearing that the murders could impact the number of tourists coming to the country, the authorities exerted immense pressure on the police to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. This also meant shifting suspicions as far away from Thailand as possible, even though investigators had barely begun their work. As a result, the investigation focused on those who had traveled to Thailand with Hannah and David, as well as migrants, essentially ignoring the local population. A police representative justified this blatant bias by simply stating that Thais wouldn't commit such acts. From the very beginning, other problems emerged. Although the police announced that checkpoints had been established to prevent anyone from leaving the island, a potential suspect had already managed to flee. Christopher Allen Ware was a close friend of David's, and the two had stayed together in an ocean view bungalow. The police hinted at a crime of passion. Christopher came under suspicion due to wounds on his hand and the fact that his bloodied pants were found in David's suitcase. 2 days later, Christopher was arrested at the airport along with his brother James, but suspicions were quickly dropped. Because of the two murder weapons, the police concluded that there were two perpetrators, and James, a possible accomplice to Christopher, if there even was one, had left the island before the murders occurred. The police later added that the DNA found on the cigarette butts on the beach did not match Christopher's DNA. With no viable suspects, the police once again turned their attention to migrants from Myanmar, comparing the DNA found at the crime scene with hundreds of individuals and conducting interviews with many others. Rumors began to circulate about the police mistreating migrants during interrogations, including threats and scalding with hot water. This wasn't the last time such allegations would arise during the investigation. Additionally, the police obtained surveillance footage from numerous bars and restaurants near the crime scene. However, many of the cameras were not operational at the time. The existing footage did not provide all the necessary information to the police. Later, suspicions arose that the police simply did not receive all the videos that could have filled important gaps, including the pier from which the perpetrators could have escaped on a boat. Nevertheless, the police focused on Burmese nationals, and within just 2 weeks of the investigation, a turning point occurred in the case. Officers identified 3 young men who were near the crime scene and caught on camera. These young men were named Mon Mon, Zo Leng, and Y Pio. They admitted to being on the beach on the night of the murders. Mon Mon was released as he could prove his legal presence in the country. However, 22-year-olds Zo and Y were detained as illegal migrants. Exactly 1 day after their detention, the young men confessed to the murder of Hannah and David. Investigators were confident that they had found the killers due to 2 crucial pieces of evidence. First, their DNA perfectly matched the DNA samples found at the crime scene and on Hannah's body. Second, detectives believed they could prove the theft of David's phone by Y Fio. He claimed he had simply found it on the beach and intended to sell it to make some money. However, Thai police contacted the British police, National Crime Agency, and using the phone's serial number, confirmed that it belonged to David. Following their confession, a shocking and unconventional reenactment of the crime followed, in which the men publicly demonstrated to the media what they allegedly did to the victims and asked for forgiveness. Despite this, for a moment, it seemed like the case was closed. The men stated that they had been drinking on the beach on the night of the murders and purportedly confessed to the police that their main target was the girl. However, things soon became much more complicated. Firstly, the men had never had any prior issues with the law. As soon as they were allowed to speak with a representative from their home country's embassy, they retracted their confessions. Zo Leng and Y Fio claimed that their confessions had been coerced. They alleged that they were beaten, left naked in a cold room, threatened with electric shocks, and hinted that they could be killed if they didn't confess. They were also told that if they confessed, 2 years in prison. The interrogation was conducted in the presence of a single translator who happened to work as a shopkeeper on the island. Other compelling evidence that, according to investigators, they had against the men soon came under close scrutiny. At the center of these disputes were DNA samples. While the police claimed that they had taken several samples for testing from Hannah's body, the murder weapons and cigarette butts found nearby, it was no longer a secret to anyone that the police had poorly secured the crime scene. Officers simply didn't know how to properly handle a crime scene, allowing tourists, journalists, and onlookers to roam the beach for days after the murders had occurred. The claim that Zo Leng had stolen David's phone also seemed suspicious because officers had previously admitted that the phone had been given to them by David's friend. Nonetheless, the trial of the accused began in July 2015. The 18 days of the trial stretched over several weeks and revealed even more problems. Firstly, the defense was not given additional time to prepare for the trial and was only allowed a brief meeting with their clients before the trial began. It was only during the trial that they gained access to the 900-page police report, which was filled with unclear and contradictory information. Key evidence contained errors, such as the initial DNA analysis report having the wrong date and consisting of handwritten parts that were partially crossed out. Clearly, this became such an issue that even the prosecutors publicly demanded corrections to the documents. Moreover, many potential witnesses who could have provided alibis for the accused or come forward with additional information refused to do so, fearing persecution by the authorities. This was especially true for migrants who were already in a vulnerable position because the majority of them were in the country illegally. On July 10th, it seemed that the defense had achieved a small victory when the court ordered a retesting of DNA evidence in the case, amidst allegations of possible contamination of the samples, a claim supported by the country's chief forensic pathologist, Dr. Pornthip Rojanasunand, who had not been allowed to participate in the original investigation. However, it quickly became apparent that key DNA samples had been completely depleted during the initial analysis, particularly the DNA from Hannah and David's bodies. DNA from the murder weapons was available, and according to the police, still linked the accused to the crime. But when the country's chief forensic pathologist was allowed to conduct tests himself, he stated that he had found DNA from another man, but it did not match any of the accused. Additionally, at least one witness claimed that the hoe and wooden stick had been cleaned after they were found. The defense consulted with renowned Australian forensic scientist Jane Taupin, who found the speed at which the Thai police collected and analyzed DNA samples to be unusual, especially considering that one sample contained the DNA of multiple individuals, including the victims. The police claimed that they were able to isolate and analyze the samples in less than 12 hours. Jane indicated to the lawyers that this was highly unusual and suspicious for the complex analysis of this kind. Given that several forms of these tests contained errors and some parts were rewritten, Jane subtly suggested that either the tests were conducted incorrectly or they were simply fraudulent. Overall, it seemed that the defense would have no trouble dismantling the case of the prosecution. However, they made two strange decisions. Firstly, they did not request Jane Taupin to testify in court, even though Jane insisted that her testimony would be crucial in shedding light on the problems with the DNA analysis. It is unclear why the defense did not want Jane to testify, but most likely, the lawyers feared that the testimony of a foreign expert would bias the judges against their clients. In addition to this, the defense only mentioned the DNA evidence in their closing statements along with other information, while the prosecutors made DNA matching a central part of the trial and constantly reminded the judges of it. This decision ultimately determined the outcome of the case. In late December 2015, the accused were found guilty and sentenced to the maximum penalty. In 2016 and 2017, the appeals were unsuccessful, and in 2019, the final verdict was delivered when Thailand's Supreme Court upheld the sentence, emphasizing that the evidence against the convicted individuals was clear, reliable, and detailed. In August 2020, in honor of the king's birthday, and as a sign of his leniency, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Following the verdict, protests took place in Myanmar, and various human rights organizations called for an investigation into numerous allegations against the Thai police. British media dubbed Koh Tao the Death Island. However, this bad publicity did not lead to any significant consequences as the two men remained in prison. Although the number of tourists slightly decreased immediately after the murders, it did not have a long-term impact on Thailand's tourism. Nevertheless, this did not quell the wave of outrage from the international community, which believed that the Burmese migrants had been made scapegoats from the beginning. An authoritative publication even wrote that nobody really believed that they had killed the British tourists. Online activists from Anonymous hacked the Thai police website and released a controversial video accusing the police of framing the young men. The video received support from an unexpected source, Hannah's sister. Laura posted a furious message on Facebook criticizing Thailand. If the guys didn't kill Hannah and David, then who did? The most popular theory is the involvement of the Koh Tao Mafia. This theory emerged shortly after the murders when a 25-year-old street musician named Sean McCanna posted on Facebook that he knew who committed the murders. Sean claimed to have seen two local residents harassing Hannah on the night before the killings, and David came to her rescue. Sean took a photo of the Thai men and posted it online, allegedly receiving threats as a result. Sean fled the island, claiming that the local mafia wanted to kill him. In reality, when referring to the mafia on the island, people often mean influential families rather than organized crime groups. One particular family was frequently associated with the case, as they owned more cafes and restaurants on the beach than anyone else. The owner of the hotel where Hannah and David stayed also belonged to this family. This man played a significant role in the investigation and was even present on the beach when the police collected evidence. According to his account, he demanded an explanation for why Sean was seen covered in blood on the night of the murders. A week after the murders, in the presence of 2 police officers, he questioned Sean about the blood. Sean did not provide a clear answer, left the bar, and ran to a supermarket. The men followed him and asked why he had run away, claiming that no one had threatened him. For some time, the police considered Sean a suspect, but eventually allowed him to leave the island after he admitted that he had cut himself before the murders. Supporting the theory that the culprits belonged to an influential Thai family, and that's why they were protected by the police, is a police report stating that a member of the influential island family was considered a suspect. However, the police officer who recorded this information was transferred, and there was no further mention of the family. It's possible that this theory contains some truth, but the actual truth may lie elsewhere. We simply don't know. What we can be sure of is the tragic loss of Hannah and David, 2 young people at the beginning of their independent lives who went on vacation to celebrate their academic achievements. Their lives were cut short at a time when they should have felt happier and more carefree than ever before. It's hard to imagine what both families went through, but Hannah's family had to endure it for the second time. In 2019, Hannah's sister Laura became seriously ill, and on September 16, 2019, exactly 5 years and 1 day after Hannah's death, Laura also passed away. Throughout the time that the guys continue to serve their sentences in prison, the number of tourists on Koh Tao who have died under unexplained circumstances continues to rise. Local police quickly close cases, classifying incidents as accidents or claiming that individuals wanted to end their own lives. In 2015, 23-year-old Christina Ansley mysteriously died in her bungalow, and the police closed the case without conducting toxicological tests or even talking to the last person who saw her alive in her bungalow. That same year, 25-year-old British national Nick Pearson died on Koh Tao. His body was found in the sea the day after he went missing. According to the police, he fell from a 15-meter cliff into the sea and drowned. However, his parents are convinced that this is physically impossible due to the location of the hotel. In 2015, 29-year-old Frenchman Dimitri Povse was found hanged in his bungalow. The police considered the case straightforward, despite the fact that the man's hands were tied behind his back, and there were lacerations on his body. In 2016, 26-year-old Luke Miller was found dead in a swimming pool. In 2017, 23-year-old Russian Valentina Novozhenova disappeared, leaving her passport, phone, money, and return ferry ticket in her room. That same year, 30-year-old Belgian tourist Elise Dalamain died, and her body was found in the jungle. The police believed that the woman's death was her own decision, but the mystery surrounding her death became even more convoluted when it was revealed that Elise had gone to great lengths to conceal her true identity by staying at a hotel on Koh Tao.
Horia Mumnai and Cassandre Bouvier became friends in Paris while studying at the Sorbonne. The girls were passionate about the cultures of other countries, especially Latin America, so they studied the history, social and political movements, and culture of the region. Horia, who was born in Morocco, was 24 years old. After completing her thesis on Argentina, she decided to put aside her books and visit the country she had written about. Cassandra, at the age of 29, was no stranger to traveling the world, so she gladly accepted her friend's invitation. The girls packed their suitcases and embarked on a journey through the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. In July 2011, the friends arrived in Salta. It is a province located in the northwest of Argentina with a very interesting geographical, social, and historical repertoire. The landscapes range from snow-capped peaks in the west to plains with a tropical dry climate in the east. The architecture includes churches and cathedrals built during the colonial period, ideal for exploration and study by curious students. However, it is worth noting that, like many provinces in the north of the country and probably throughout Latin America, Salta maintains conservative customs. The influence of the Catholic Church on people's daily lives is significant, and the differences between social classes are pronounced. Politics is controlled by a few influential families who have held power for decades. It is important to mention that as this story unfolds, things will become clearer shortly. On July 15, Cassandra and Horia checked into a hotel in Salta, and set out to explore the sites without unpacking their belongings, as they planned to return to Buenos Aires. Salta is a popular province among tourists, known for its low crime rate and friendly population, especially towards tourists. The main attraction in Salta is the natural reserve called Quebrada de San Lorenzo. At exactly 16:23 on July 15, the girls purchased tickets to visit the reserve. They decided not to hire a guide and ventured deep into the forest. From Buenos Aires, they were supposed to contact their families and inform them of the next city they planned to visit. However, no word was heard from them. On the 19th, unable to bear the uncertainty, their families reached out to Cassandra and Horia's acquaintances in Argentina and asked them to contact the police. 2 weeks later, a group of tourists from a neighboring town embarked on the same trail as the French girls. They arrived at the reserve quite late in the evening, but it was not unusual in this area. Around 1800 hours, one of the tourists separated from the group to find a secluded spot in the dense undergrowth. There, he noticed something resembling a body. Approaching and confirming that it was indeed a body, he screamed and rushed back to the group to inform them of his discovery. The police arrived at the reserve around 10 p.m. The tourists had not marked the exact location where they found the body, only mentioning that it was near a viewpoint. Therefore, in the darkness and amidst the dense vegetation, the police initially struggled to locate it. Eventually, they found the body, but before they could begin their work, they discovered 2 more victims just a few meters away. It turned out to be the 2 missing French tourists. The police developed several theories, including the possibility that the girls were accidentally shot by a local hunter, as many residents in the area hunt for food. Therefore, the search focused on local residents. The police arrested Francisco Tejeda, who worked as a horseback riding guide for tourists. However, he was released just a few days later as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. His wife told the press that her husband was arrested solely because they were poor people. The police needed a scapegoat to appease public opinion. Immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the police shared with the press that they had been lying in the forest for about 3 days. Since the girls had kept their tickets to the reserve for the 15th, various theories arose about what could have happened to them during the remaining days when they were reported missing. It was speculated that they might have been kidnapped, held captive somewhere, and then disposed of. However, the police later clarified that the girls were killed 14 days prior, and they had been lying in the reserve near the viewpoint all that time. Due to Cassandra's torn clothing and Uria's pants and underwear being pulled down to her knees, speculations about violence against the girls emerged. The autopsy confirmed this. The tourists were severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot with a .22 caliber firearm. In the reserve, the police found a corresponding shell casing. They concluded that the girls had managed to take a walk and returned to the entrance of the reserve. There were few visitors at that time, the sun was setting, and the weather was not conducive to late walks. Obviously, it was then that the perpetrator or perpetrators approached their victims, with one attacker assaulting Cassandra. After the violence inflicted upon her, the girl was shot in the head while kneeling before her killer. Uria, who witnessed Cassandra's murder, decided not to give up too easily. A clump of hair remained in her clenched fist, indicating her struggle with at least one assailant. Then, according to investigators' assumptions, the girl dashed down the slope from the height when she was caught by a bullet. It hit her in the back, passing through her shoulder. The culprits left, believing that Uria was also finished. However, she was still alive and attempted to crawl back to the trail. Nevertheless, her attempts were unsuccessful as she was too weak and endured several more hours of agony before succumbing to blood loss. The investigators examined the girls' hotel room and found only one phone among their belongings, instead of the expected 2. By determining the location of Uria's phone, they discovered that a local girl named Maria Fernanda Cañizares, the daughter of a former police officer, was using it. They also found Uria's camera in her possession. The girl claimed that these were gifts from her boyfriend, Gustavo Lossi. Gustavo, 23 years old, worked as a guide in the reserve, and his father sold tickets to tourists. It was Gustavo who had offered his services to the French girls, but they declined. Gustavo had changed the SIM card in the phone, thinking that would be enough to avoid detection. Not immediately, but Gustavo Lossi confessed to being present at the crime scene and participating in the violence. However, he claimed that he was not the instigator or the killer of the French girls but merely a witness. He recounted that upon hearing noise and running to the screams, he witnessed 2 men, 24-year-old Daniel Vilt, a stonemason, and 31-year-old Santos Clemente Vera, a gardener from the San Lorenzo plain, tormenting the girls. Supposedly, these men coerced him into participating in the violence and then allowed him to leave. However, he didn't forget to take the girl's phone and camera with him. However, during a search of Gustavo's home, the police discovered the weapon that fired the fatal shots. Uria's camera helped the police establish the exact time of the attack on the French girls. The girls were enjoying sightseeing and took several photos just before embarking on a hike through the reserve. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, at 6:28 p.m., the tourists took their last photo, which turned out blurry and unclear, allowing investigators to speculate that the attack occurred precisely at that moment. All 3 men were charged with murder. Witnesses immediately came forward, pointing to Vilt as the person who attempted to sell a rifle. However, he had a solid alibi as he was at a bank during the time of the attack and could prove it. In 2014, Gustavo Lossi was sentenced to 30 years in prison, while Vera was released due to insufficient evidence and his denial of guilt. He also claimed to have an alibi. However, the prosecutor demanded a review of the case, and in 2016, both men were sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed that one of the most high-profile cases in Argentine history had reached its conclusion. But no, the story doesn't end there. French journalist Jean-Charles Chattard dedicated 4 years to his own investigation of this case and wrote a book presenting his arguments as to why the girls couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve on July 15, as the investigators claim. The journalist is convinced that the girls didn't die in the reserve, their bodies were simply brought there after the murder. Firstly, even after a short walk in the reserve, his shoes were covered in dust and dirt, unlike the victim's shoes. The girls couldn't have taken such a path, then endured violence, fought for their lives, and still had clean shoes. Secondly, the appearance of the tourists, in general, was strange. Their clothing was more suited for an evening event in the city rather than a hike in the nature reserve. The next strange thing is that the bodies lay in Quebrada de San Lorenzo for 2 weeks. The reserve is a wild, open area inhabited by pumas, foxes, and condors. After such a period, the police could have found completely gnawed bones. However, the bodies were discovered without a single bite mark. Not to mention that they were lying in a popular reserve near a frequently visited viewpoint. Finally, the pathologist who examined the bodies confidently stated that they were killed 3 to a maximum of 5 days before the autopsy. Regarding the date of the murders, the doctor is categorical and indicated in the report that it was July 26, 2011. Remarkably, the judge who led the investigation changed this date to July 15. Could it be possible that the judge intentionally manipulated the facts to protect someone? Could the judge intentionally tamper with evidence? Was he trying to protect someone? This is exactly what Nestor Piccolo, the commissioner in charge of the investigation, was convinced of, and it may have cost him his life. Commissioner Piccolo died under mysterious circumstances 4 months after the start of the investigation. He was found at the entrance of the commissioner's office, with a bullet in his head. His mother stated that it was her son's decision, but she is certain that he was killed, and it was an execution. No traces of gunpowder were found on Nestor's hands, and before his death, he was working on a new version. According to Clemente Vera, he is innocent, and Gustavo Lossi is simply an accomplice of the real criminals, representatives of the upper classes of the province. Nicholas's investigation worried many people who wanted to hide the truth, including the judge. And the influential local families could not allow the light to be shed on the deaths of the French girls. However, this conspiracy of silence was interrupted in April 2014 by an anonymous letter describing the same trail that Commissioner Piccolo was investigating. The letter was sent to the victims' families in France. Chattard received a copy of it and pursued this lead. The anonymous letter was handwritten by a woman who chose not to sign it out of fear of testifying in court. Chattard spent several months, but eventually found a witness. It turned out to be a girl who is often in the company of a small circle of influential individuals in Salta. She knew that on July 15, 2011, the two tourists couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve because they were invited to a party organized by the city's wealthy youth. She paints a completely different picture of what happened. At such parties, alcohol flows freely, and everything resembles a movie, but it's all happening in real life. According to the girl, Cassandra and Uriah were among the guests and were seen near the pool. As the evening progressed and more drinks were consumed, the men became increasingly interested in the attractive French women. Around 3 a.m., they led them inside the house, and no one saw them after that. The guys started harassing one of the tourists. Of course, she refused, but her opinion no longer mattered to the men, and things went too far. Her friend witnessed what happened, so the guys decided to kill both of them to prevent the truth from being revealed. However, they didn't rush. They tortured the victims for several days before finally killing them. The witness provided the exact location where this supposedly happened, a villa in the most fashionable district of the city, Buena Vista, where deputies, ministers, and wealthy foreigners reside. The villa is usually not occupied permanently as it is often rented out for private parties. There is also a pool, which is where the French women were last seen. But the most intriguing part is the villa's location, right beneath where the bodies were found. Behind the house, there is a hidden path leading to the lookout point of the nature reserve. If everything happened as the witness claims, the bodies of the girls were carried under the cover of night, taken through that path, and left in the dense undergrowth of the reserve. However, how could such a wild scenario, unfolding at a party in plain sight, remain a secret for so long? The witness claims that it can be explained by the terror imposed by the real criminals on anyone who dares to speak up. According to her, the party was organized by the son of a deputy, who attacked the French woman. When she tried to escape, he severely beat her. 2 other sons of the politician were also involved in the assault and later in the murder. Today, the deputy's face calmly looks down from numerous billboards during his latest election campaign. By the way, one of his sons followed in his father's footsteps and became a politician as well. The politician refused to comment on these allegations, but one judge who presided over the initial investigation showed a great interest in the story described in the anonymous letter. He believes that it contains everything necessary to achieve justice. However, the judge who took over the case afterward had no intention of seeking other culprits. He believes that the family must be very influential to manipulate the police, and he attributes the deaths of the French women to the provincial justice system. The new version gives more weight to the witness's story, according to which he saw the 2 French women leaving the nature reserve on July 15. This means that the crime could have occurred in a different place and at a different time than what the investigators insist on. As for the blurred photograph supposedly taken during the attack in the nature reserve, Cassandra's father, Jean-Michel Bouvier, submitted the photo to an expert who believes that it has been manipulated using a photo editing program. The angle of the shot and the lighting cannot be as depicted in the photograph. In France, the victims' families no longer expect anything from the justice system. Jean-Michel Bouvier conducted an independent DNA analysis on his daughter's body. DNA from Gustavo Lossi and 2 other male individuals, as well as 1 female DNA, were found on the most intimate parts. There was no trace of Clemente Vieira's sample. The ownership of the other samples remains unknown, raising questions about the identities of the other individuals involved in the attack on the girls and the true role of Gustavo Lossi. Meanwhile, in the heart of San Lorenzo, a few hundred meters from the place where Cassandra and Uriah's bodies were found, there still stands the modest home of Clemente Vieira's parents. After their son's arrest, they struggle to make ends meet, as they are unable to work the land or care for animals in their advanced age. Clemente's parents, his wife, and many local residents believe in his innocence. They believe that his only fault is living close to the crime scene, and not having the means to afford lawyers. It is especially sad considering that nothing in the case files connects him to the crime. He claims that the police beat him and threatened him and his child, demanding a confession to the murder. When he refused to comply, they ransacked his house in search of any incriminating evidence, but they were unsuccessful. In connection with this, in 2017, Santos Clemente Vieira filed a complaint with the Supreme Court of Argentina, and in June 2020, he was granted permission for a case review. He hopes that a new trial will be conducted, during which he will be acquitted. Interestingly, Cassandra's father is convinced of his innocence. He witnessed all the hearings, traveled to Argentina multiple times to learn the details of the case, and conducted his own investigation, concluding that Vieira did not commit the crime. Therefore, he visited Vieira in prison, apologized to him, and then started a social media campaign for his release. Bouvier is concerned that the case review is taking an endlessly long time, while an innocent person continues to sit in prison in Salta. On November 25, 2013, on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a monument was solemnly unveiled in memory of Cassandra and Uriah. Alfredo Garzon, a sculptor from Salta who lived in Paris, responded to Jean-Michel Bouvier's request to take on this work. By depicting an outstretched hand, eyes, and the face with an anguished expression, Alfredo managed to create a very powerful image conveying the pain, horror, and suffering that the girls went through. The sculpture is located in the San Lorenzo ravine, where the victims' bodies were found.